Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I would like to express my thanks to St. Joe's and to Matthias for this very kind invitation to not just join one session, but two sessions. And it's an absolute privilege to be chairing both these sessions, where I have some very illustrious and distinguished panelists, both from policy practitioning and also from the academia. Let me also compliment both the Director of St. Joe's, Director of St. Joe's, and Dr. Monojit Das for putting together this event over the next 2 days. So what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to set the tone of the proceedings in the next, let's say, 13 to 15 minutes by talking to you in more overarching terms about how do we relate back to our maritime culture and maritime history. Now, as a civilizational nation with a resplendent civilizational antecedents, we always have to hark back to the best inheritances that we have so as to be able to create the trappings and the foundations of a modern, robust and resilient society. And as we look forward to 2047, we need to look at certain important markers that take us back into history, not dwell in history or remain situated in history, but to process what history has taught us, what are the instructive lessons, and then to be able to filter that into policy and inform the progression of our nation. So I'm going to start with 5 or 6 markers which I see in contemporary India that have a certain harking back relevance. The INS Tarini made 2 circumnavigations across the globe. The most recent one that came back in May. And while everyone has been in awe of what has been done, if you look back into our history and if you look at the incidents and the magnitude of our circumnavigation in history, it should not surprise anyone that we are not only being audacious in our ambition in terms of circumnavigation, but we are also being very benevolent in our accomplishment. In 2017, Rodrigo Duterte, the president of Philippines, when he reached out to Prime Minister Modi and said, I want to prioritize the relationship with Philippines, it wasn't done to the BrahMos. The BrahMos came much later. It was done effectively by him telling Prime Minister Modi, we need to launch and commission a joint project on maritime archaeology, because I have come across definitive evidence of how your maritime imperial voyages were not just in the Malay Peninsula, but they extended all the way out so far, that far out west in the Pacific to the Philippines. And since then, we put together archaeological surveys, and our relationship actually is founded in that affinity that we draw on, where a Roman Catholic country and a predominantly Hindu country is brought together by maritime culture, by a culture of tolerance, a culture of diversity, and a culture of eclecticness. When Prime Minister Modi in 2018 at Shangri-La spoke about India's maritime doctrine and said it's not FOIP, it's FOIIP, with the second I being inclusive, he wasn't simply making a statement. When he went to Indonesia thereafter, he proposed to President Jokowi that Andaman Nicobar and Aceh province must be brought together. We were talking of the stitch ship. Let's stitch these two regions together, because these regions not only have very old affinities that we can see, but also they make a lot of geostrategic sense. And we proposed the Sabang port, and of course that port is now being built, and the whole idea is to link the transshipment container hub that's being created in Andaman Nicobar with Sabang port. And I say this because for a long time in our maritime doctrine, we were constantly harped upon as Indonesia being the extended neighbor. I don't think it's an extended neighbor. I think if this is our thinking, which of course draws on history and our historical linkages to our east, then Indonesia is our next door neighbor. A next door neighbor doesn't have to be only one who shares with you a physical boundary, a land boundary. Somebody who is close to you in terms of a maritime boundary can equally be qualifying as a next door neighbor. When India spoke about Sagar 10 years ago in 2015, and now has called it Mahasagar, we used a very interesting doctrine because this doctrine stands out from any other doctrine. When we say security and growth for all in the region, these two words, security and growth, are not hegemonic in nature. They are benign, they are consensual, they are eclectic, and they are multilateral in nature. These are universal impulses for any nation. Whether it's the most preponderant nation in the world, the United States, whether it's a rising peer power, China, or even a small country, let's say like the Maldives, for any country that operates in the maritime landscape, security and growth are always the impulses. And where do we draw these impulses and why an ideation along this axis? Why the use of the word security and growth? Is because through 2,500 years of our maritime culture, our voyages, our connects, our navigation has always emphasized growth and has always emphasized security, and both of them are done collectively and consensually. So when I say this because we need to understand that when we go back in history, our history is not just a chronological evolution of our maritime orientation. There are some very important milestones and annals that we have to look at. Our maritime orientation has been pioneering. We've gone east, we've also gone west, and more importantly, from the east we have gone west, and from our west coast we have gone east. I would just take you back to 2019 when Prime Minister Modi hosted President Xi at Mahabalipuram or Mamalapuram. Everyone started Googling, oh, why there all of a sudden? It should have been in Delhi and Hyderabad house chhod ke wahan kyun, right? There was a huge instructive factor there because it talks of sustained engagement that our voyages had, imperial voyages had, across the east, not only in the Malay Peninsula, but going all the way up East Asia. And why I say this? Because when India is asked, what is your connectivity trajectory in the Indo-Pacific? Our connectivity trajectory goes both sides because our imperial expanse was also both sides. So when we talk of the Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor, just look at the trajectory of that corridor and go back and see how the Pallavas, for instance, had connected with China, and you will see a resemblance of that trajectory. When we consider Bandar Abbas and Chabahar as being very important for our geopolitical goals today, look at what had happened on the west coast of India when we connected from the west coast to Sumeria, which is Iraq, Mesopotamia, and that trajectory goes right through the Gulf. When we look at our engagement with Arabia, we understand why IMEC makes a lot of sense today. And it does so in a collective manner. While trajectories around the world today are being put across individually by nations or dominated by nations, so for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, we are told brings the best traditions of Chinese maritime voyages, but it is a hegemonic, singularly instrumentalized project. But when the Chennai-Vladivostok Maritime Corridor, or the International North-South Transport Corridor, or the IMEC happens, what is the classic difference? The classic difference is it's consensual, it's multi-stakeholder, it is both actor and stakeholder driven, and this in fact flows from some of the instructive lessons of how we have treated our maritime domain in the past. The maritime domain brings in a very important element because what you see is not what you get. What you don't see is more existential. And I say this because there was a time in 1971 when Bangladesh, a new young liberated Bangladesh, asked us for meteorological data. And we turned it down on grounds of national security. Come 2014, we go and offer and commission a SARC satellite for our immediate neighbors. And what was the thinking behind that? The thinking was effectively to connect cyberspace, outer space, and deep sea for the benefit of neighbors. So the maritime history of India, when we look at it, offers us many interesting lessons. Firstly, the enduringness of our maritime civilization. The two words should be used very well. I like to use them as well. Chirantar and Nirantar. Nirantar is continuous. Chirantar is eternal. There is a certain eternal current that India's maritime tradition has. It's not a contrived tradition that you have to pick up some example from somewhere and say, oh, this makes me a maritime nation. We are a normal maritime nation which was thinking abnormally. We are simply coming back to being normal. Because today we use these words like normalizing relations. Okay, normalize the country. Iran has to be normalized. Taliban is trying to normalize. I think in some way, instances like this, when we bring practitioners and scholars together, is to normalize our abnormal thinking. And why do I say that? Because if you look at the entire twist of our maritime evolution, despite the fact that there have been so many invasions, there have been so many aggressions, and also we must keep in mind our maritime history was not necessarily always well documented. We've been very poor documenters, and we've lost a lot because of not documenting. But yet we have enough in terms of empirical and anecdotal evidence to be able to counter what may not have been documented. So the point realizes that when the Bombay dock was created in 1735 by the British, they go back to using some of the technologies which were used in Lothal. What does it tell you? Nirantar and Chirantar. Right? When our ships made an impressive impact, so much so that everyone from Marco Polo down to Vasco da Gama, and this is mentioned in the archaeology that is there in British archives, have said that these ships are so imposing, they're 3 times the size of ships we can imagine. These are ships put together with the kind of variegated materials that Europe could never think about. These have been put together of different ticket sizes in terms of how many people it can carry, how much payload it can carry. It just shows you what a higher order maritime civilization that we were. We use this word higher order today when we try to describe progressive economies, progressive ecosystems. This is what higher order maritime civilization was. However, we have to take instructive lessons. So when Nirmala Sitharaman in her budget announces a 25,000 crore strategic maritime fund, we shouldn't be going, oh, we should be saying this should have come earlier. Because we are going back to the best traditions and trying to build back our shipbuilding, which has fallen on such perdition and ruin that we've had smaller nations like Philippines and Vietnam actually outpace us. So we are simply going back to recapture and reclasp the best aspects of our civilizational splendor. When Modi 3.0 makes ports the defining element of his agenda, we shouldn't be saying why. We should be saying this should have come earlier. Because a country with once a 7,516 kilometer coastline, now 11,198 on recomputation, with 1,382 features outside our immediate territory, is asking the question why it should build ports. We should always have had the ports that we have planning, the 13 ports and the 200 minor ports. Please look at Maritime India vision that has been placed for 2030. When we say maritime, the maritime is not only outbound, maritime is outbound and inbound. Maritime does not apply only to seas and oceans. It as much applies to your rivers, your lakes and internal navigation. But we know the weaknesses of inland water navigation that have persisted in this country. So when the Maritime India vision talks about a comprehensive ecosystem, we are only going back to Chandragupta Maurya, who in his time had also established a comprehensive maritime doctrine that talked about not just about going abroad, but also working in. My last point that I leave for consideration, we today talk of inbound, outbound continuum when we talk of maritime strategies and maritime doctrine. So what we say is, a lot of what happens in sea today is not essentially conditioned or impacted or impinged by what happens at sea. There are impacting factors on land. And that's why BIMSTEC in 2018, in its summit, for the first time used a phrase which has never been used before and probably has been used a lot later, which is blend the maritime and mountain economies. Bring terrestrial and the amphibious into one continuum. We talk lateral continuum, Indo-Pacific. I am introducing something which Indian maritime civilization had already placed before us, but we were not able to identify. And that was, and if you see in history, we of course talk about the Cholas, the Vijayanagara Empire, etc., the Kalingas and all. But at the same time, we talk of the Satavahanas, we talk of the Maurya period, and many of them were principally land-based. Their orientation was maritime, but they were principally land-based. So it tells you this thinking about land looking at the sea and sea looking at the land in a mutually reinforcing continuum was something which was an underpinning of our maritime orientation. The fault lay that we did not appreciate this, we did not leverage this, we did not integrate this within our statecraft. It's now thankfully happening, and hopefully the times are going to be better. Thank you.